So now that you've learned about internal versus external iteration and iterators in Java, let's go ahead and talk about the pros and cons of each of the approaches. So we'll start first by discussing the advantages of internal iteration and internal iterators over external iteration and external iterators. And there certainly are a number of benefits here. The first one is improved code readability. And let's kind of show some examples to make that more clear. So you'll see here with the internal iteration approach, which is what, of course, we get with Java streams, the focus, as always with streams, is on the what rather than the how. There are no control flow operations explicitly in the code. So things like conditional expressions, conditional statements are handled by filter. The overall iteration mechanism is handled by the stream of and the whole streams framework, and you don't have to worry about any of those types of things. So the code can be read in a more concise and linear way from top to bottom. Alternatively, here's the same behavior, except this time, of course, it's using more classic Java object-oriented features like the for each loop and an if statement and so on, more imperative. It's focusing on the how, which is imperative, as opposed to the what, which is declarative. And so you can see here that those control flow constructs are actually literally part of the solution. If you think about your assignment number 2A, I've been encouraging you to get around or avoid using if statements. There's a handful of places where they come in handy, for example, checking to see if something is null. But in general, you want to replace the use of explicit if statements with the streams approach. Now, keep in mind that it is permissible to use conditional expressions like the ternary operator, the question mark colon operator. But that's not really a statement. That's an operator, and it's an expression. So again, this approach here, more concise, more readable, more linear. This approach, more conditional, more iterative explicitly. Another great benefit of using internal iteration is the fact that you can get transparent optimizations. And this is probably one of the biggest wins. So you can see here that it's easy to convert our sequential solution into a parallel version simply by slipping in parallel or putting parallel in here, and then your stream will transparently run in parallel. Conversely, if you look down here, this approach always uses the sequential accumulator anti-pattern. So it's always sequential. If you want to learn more about the accumulator anti-pattern, take a look at the link below, which is an article by Brian Getz, who's one of the senior architects for the Java platform, and he talks about what is the accumulator anti-pattern. And basically what it says is, if you use this kind of an approach with a for each loop and so on, it's going to be very, very hard to make your code run in parallel. Whereas if you use this approach up here, it's absolutely trivial to do that. There's also potential for fewer bugs by using internal iteration. What's an example of this, you might ask? Well, one of the cool things about using streams is that it does not split creation from initialization of collections. You'll notice that we're going to be assigning to the URLs field or URLs variable as a consequence of the collect terminal operation being called at the end of the stream. And that all takes place automatically. You don't have to worry about initializing URLs. You don't have to remember to assign it to a real value before you add it, add things to it, and so on. It takes care of itself as the consequence of using collect. In contrast, this approach, which we see down here, splits creation from initialization. So we're making something called URLs, and we're creating a variable called URLs, and we have to remember to call new array list or new linked list or whatever to initialize it. If we don't do that, then when we come down here and call add, we'll get a null pointer exception, which of course is error prone. And I think you could also argue that perhaps having to put explicit control constructs makes the code potentially buggier as well. So the nice approach with the internal iteration model is you don't have to worry about any of these things. It's all taken care of for you. Of course, as I always like to say, it's not all unicorns and rainbows. There are some potential downsides with internal iteration. So let's talk about some of the advantages that external iterators have over internal iterators. So one nice thing is there's more control over iteration steps. So one of the problems with an internal iterator model is if you decide you want to bail out before you're done iterating over the entire stream or the entire collection that's been converted into a stream, you're going to have to explicitly throw an exception. And that's not necessarily bad. It just means that you've got to do that, and it's a little bit uglier. It's hard to prematurely cease the iteration before you get to process all the elements. In contrast, if you use external iteration, then since you have control over the flow of the steps, at any point in time, you can say, all right, that's it, I'm done. I'm going to break out of here. So it gives you more power in order to be able to exit at some arbitrary point. Now, again, in this particular example, that might not be what you want, so it could be buggier, but you do have more control with the use of external iteration. Another difference between internal iteration and external iteration is that you can have multiple iterators active simultaneously over the same object, iterating through different portions or in different ways. So in this particular example, it's not a particularly interesting example, but we create a couple of iterators and then we can iterate through them and treat them in separate ways. This would be more interesting if there were different ways you could traverse through the list in some different traversal orders, and you could have different iterators at different points throughout the traversal. In contrast, there can be only one internal iterator for a stream, much like the classic movie Highlander. There can be only one. And so as a consequence, you have less functionality, less flexibility, but you also have easier code to understand, easier to optimize, and arguably fewer bugs. So you get to choose which is more important and which is more relevant for you. For my money, increasingly, it makes a lot of sense to do internal iteration because that's what comes out of the box with Java streams. So that's the end of the evaluation of internal versus external iteration and iterators in Java. And hopefully this will give you a better understanding of what's actually happening with Java streams. We will start talking shortly about other internals of Java streams, which will give you a deeper appreciation of what's actually taking place behind the scenes and under the hood, as they like to say.